This is part of the series Important Questions in K-12 STEM Education with me, Todd Hutner. That is a picture of me, my first year teaching. That was taken almost 20 years ago now. I've taught science in Tallahassee and Austin, and now I'm with Argument Driven Inquiry. And I wrote many of the investigations in our grades 3 through high school materials. And if you're interested, my LinkedIn is there at the bottom. And at the end, I will put my email as well. Jill Gregory will be joining us. She's going to moderate today. So that's an important question in STEM education. And I want to start off by, at this point in the school year, so I'm recording this in early March, school administrators are often preparing for three things. They're preparing for spring break, they're preparing for completing the annual evaluations of teachers, and they're preparing for end of year tests. And as just a preview, in a couple weeks, I will talk about preparing for the end of year tests as part of this webinar series. So I think it's important to think about that teacher evaluation systems have made major improvements over the past 20 years. And in part of these systems are rubrics that are developed to help focus the evaluations on things teachers do to enhance student learning. Many states use a modified version of Charlotte Danielson's framework for teaching, and this has 4 dimensions: planning and preparation, learning environments, learning experiences, and principled teaching. And so here's just an example from Texas, where I live. We've got planning, instruction, learning environment, and professional practices and responsibilities. So similar dimensions to Danielson. Here's from Pennsylvania's handbook for evaluating teachers. You have 4 domains of professional practices. And then here in Arizona, or I should say not here in Arizona, but in Arizona, they actually are explicit that they use Charlotte Danielson's framework as part of their evaluation. And I want to be clear that these rubrics provide some general guidance for school-based administrators. So here in Texas, if we're talking about the dimension of content knowledge and expertise, I'm going to blow up, make it a little bit bigger and easier to see, the student-centered actions. So it talks about things that the teacher does. They integrate learning objectives with other disciplines. They anticipate possible student misunderstandings, provide students opportunities to use different types of thinking. Here is Pennsylvania, another component that talks about what the teacher's doing and helping focus that evaluation. So blowing up this component, we have the teacher sets expectations. They, once again, are anticipating misunderstandings. They use rich language, offering brief vocabulary lessons. And here's Arizona. I couldn't find a great way to present this. So they have their rubric, once again, talks about some things that the teacher is going to do and some potential examples of what the teacher can do. So a teacher might say, here's a spot where some students have difficulty. And I think it's important here, there are some really positive aspects of these rubrics. Texas, I think, in their rubric provides multiple sources of evidence. So if we go back, I'm gonna go back here on the bottom right, they talk about their multiple sources of evidence that teachers or administrators can use when evaluating teachers. Pennsylvania includes discussion prompts for post-observation conferences between the administrator and teacher. And then Arizona provides possible indicators or examples that a teacher is at a specific level of proficiency. So there's some really nice things there. And I think that the evaluation frameworks have definitely taken a step forward from my first evaluation 20 years ago. Yet I think it's also important to be aware that there are some things missing from these rubrics. So first is an explicit focus on students. If you look back at those examples, they all talk about the teacher does this, the teacher does that. And that's true. What the teacher does matters for student learning, but only in the way that it arranges or organizes and supports learning activities of students. So I think part of a observation needs to be what students are doing along with what teachers are doing. And the other thing is the mention of subject-specific actions that the teacher and students are doing. I think this is really important. Science is different than music, is different from even math, ELA, social studies. When science use maps, the reason they're using a map is very different than maybe the reason a social studies teacher is using a map. And that might mean that the way that that map is being used is very different. So I think this brings us to a beginning of the answer of what does good science teaching look like to an observer. And I think that we need to take into account three things. One, attention to what the teacher does, attention to what the students do, and opportunities for the observer to ask why the teacher and students were engaged in specific activities and not others. I think learning is goal-directed, and so unless we fully understand the goals that the teacher has for that lesson, we are missing out potentially on why things were happening the way they were. I think that there's 5 broad dimensions of good science teaching observable during an observation. So this doesn't really get at things like the planning or other things like even how they provide written feedback or engaging with parents, but are focused on things that an administrator or other observer could use or could see. So students have a need to learn. Students are participating in the practices of science. Students interact with the teacher, peers, and ideas. Students are prompted to make their thinking visible, and students use technology in authentic ways. So dimension 1, students have a need to learn. I think here are some important indicators. And one of the things you'll notice is that there's some overlap between these. So one of the things in dimension 1 about making observations also applies to participating in the practices of science. As I mentioned before, students have a need to learn. And those of us who have been in classrooms have heard this question, when am I going to need this? And I don't think any of us could provide a specific answer. So, well, you know, you're going to need to know Newton's laws on, you know, September 18th, 2028. That doesn't seem realistic. But what we are doing is providing opportunities for students to understand the world and use ideas to do so in hopes that in the future, when they encounter a situation where those ideas are applicable, they can use them. So things like what the teacher is going to do is present a phenomenon to explain. They're going to make connections between in-school learning and students out-of-school lives. And notice I don't use the phrase the real world there, because if outside school is the real world, then inside school must be the fake world. So we're going to make connections between in-school learning and out-of-school lives. I think we're going to pose some new questions for students to ponder and present authentic problems to solve. So the eclipse is coming up, and I think one interesting question might be, do you guys think other planets have eclipses? And that's a question that students at very different levels of sophistication could answer. In this case, students are going to make observations of phenomenon. They're going to ask questions. They're going to propose a hypothesis and potentially initial solutions, and then they're going to share their current ideas. So again, students are engaging with this and asking questions about a phenomenon. And then questions we can ask the teacher after the observation. So why did you choose that phenomenon? There are a million different phenomenons we could use for ecology or for conservation of mass or Newton's laws, but why that particularly one? particular one? Or why is that problem important to solve? How do you motivate students? And why did you choose that context for the lesson? So if we're talking about, say, invasive species, why are we talking about invasive species in the Everglades and not in the Great Lakes, for example? The second dimension is students participate in the practices of science. So standards are really big now on the practices of science and engineering. And these are things that scientists do that students can also do at a developmentally appropriate level. And so teachers are going to demonstrate how to use equipment. They might model how to perform a specific analysis. They'll review and demonstrate safety precautions. They'll lead discussions on how to more productively engage in those practices. And I think the key one there is asking students to explain what they are doing and why they're doing it. So something as simple as why did you make a bar graph and not a pie chart is really important. Students are going to learn and do science at the same time. So when I was in high school, I watched my teachers talk about science, and they thought that was me learning it. And then if my class was well behaved, we might go in and do the lab as a verification. Whereas now we can learn science and do science at the same time. I think students are going to plan investigations, collect and analyze data. They're going to design, test, and refine solutions. They're going to develop, refine, and use models to explain the world. They're going to investigate and explain phenomenon, and they're going to develop scientific arguments. And then some questions for the teacher after the observation. So how do you determine the procedures for labs? How do students determine what analyses to perform? What happens if students disagree about the results of an investigation? And what do you do if students' models are not completely accurate? The third dimension is how students interact with the teacher, peers, and ideas. So learning is social. People can't learn in isolation. So part of the learning process is interacting with other people and other ideas. And a good science teaching is going to look different in that type of interaction. So I think teachers will demonstrate things like how to evaluate sources of scientific information, discussing what makes for a good critique in science. They will invite students to share ideas, explanations, and models, cause and effect, processes, those sorts of things. And I think that the teachers will use instructional materials as a tool for facilitating these interactions and not necessarily just for giving some students something to do. Now, some days we do need to give students something to do. If you have a substitute or the day after Halloween, those are maybe not the most or the best days for learning really deep content, but we want to observe the teacher using those materials to structure those interactions. I think students want to obtain and communicate information through multiple modalities. So we want to read, write, speak, listen, watch. We can create models or pictures. I think we want to revise our work based upon peer and teacher feedback, and we want to critique each other's ideas. So why do you think that? Did you think about trying this? And we're going to need to model those sorts of things for students, because critique is not something that comes naturally to many, if not most, students. And then questions we can ask the teacher after the observation are things like, how do you ensure students are thinking deeply about the science content? What kinds of questions do you ask, and what kind of responses do you expect? So if we're asking initiate, recall, evaluate question format. So who knows what Newton's third law is? Who knows where the DNA is contained? Who knows what Charles's law is, for example? Who knows what a volcano is? Those are ones where the teacher asks a question, they require a response, and then evaluate the correctness of that. And that question will generate different types of responses than a question such as, why do you think the parts of the cell work together, or what would happen if the mitochondria wasn't working correctly in the cell? I think why you choose certain media. So why are we going to watch a video or listen to something versus read about it? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of using certain materials over others? I think that's really important to get at the way that the teacher is using materials to structure those peer interactions. The fourth dimension is students make their thinking visible. I think teachers want to use assessments for multiple purposes when students make their thinking visible. They want to use different formats for an assessment as well. So multiple choice tests, written reports, evaluating arguments. I think teachers are consistently asking follow-up questions, asking students to respond to each other as well, potentially asking students to think through or evaluate the approach to solving a problem in physics, for example. I think those are important things that the teacher can do to help students make their thinking visible. And I should say, when I say making their thinking visible, I mean providing thought processes that are more than just single correct answers. So now multiple choice tests are fine. Our students are going to have to take them, if nothing else. The end of year tests are often multiple choice. The question here becomes, how do we understand what the student's thinking when they choose a specific multiple choice test, or multiple choice answer, I should say? Students, when they're making their thinking visible, are providing explanations for why they think an answer is correct, or providing explanations for why an answer is incorrect. I think they're providing feedback and critique on peer work, and they're doing so using criteria that are established in the scientific disciplines. They're developing and refining models, and these can be mathematical models, conceptual models, or physical models. They're also, I think, reevaluating prior predictions or hypotheses. One of the things that makes science unique is the ability to very accurately predict things that will occur. And I don't mean predict who's going to become president in 2040, but I do mean that we can predict what will happen if, say, we drop a hammer and a feather on the moon. And so our students making those predictions and then reevaluating those prior predictions or hypotheses and trying to explain why those were right or wrong. And then I think questions for the teacher after the observation. How do you know what students are thinking? How do you decide when to move on? And how do you use assessment to inform future learning experiences for students? I think what was the thinking behind one of the students choosing the wrong answer is really important. We ask teachers to reteach things that students aren't getting correct. But if the teacher doesn't know why the student isn't getting it correct, then we're at a disadvantage. And the fifth thing is students use technology in authentic ways. So using technology for the sake of using technology is fine, but I don't think it is a hallmark of good science teaching. So I can give a multiple choice quiz on a hard copy pencil and paper. I can also give a multiple choice quiz using one of a host of different quiz apps or websites on the internet. But that didn't really change the nature of what students are doing, nor did that mirror what scientists do when they're doing science. So I don't think Einstein, for example, took multiple choice tests when he was developing the theories of relativity. So we want students to use technology in a way that is authentic and that changes the nature of the interaction between students and ideas and the teacher to be more productive. So what a teacher will do, they'll use that to facilitate interactions. We saw the power of technology during the pandemic, but we could potentially do something with distance learning. I have friends that teach in Florida, that teach in Maryland, that teach in California. And so potentially I could connect my class with their class to do some interesting distance learning things. I think providing students options for what technology to use. So should we use a digital thermometer? What is the advantage and disadvantage to that? And is that appropriate in this use or in this context? I think we want to demonstrate effective and appropriate uses of technology. Again, using technology as a tool for collaboration. So just go on your computer and read the textbook is no different than sit in your seat and read the textbook. And I think technology is used to enhance the other 4 dimensions. So technology can be a really important piece of making students' thinking visible or allowing them to observe phenomenon. So I can't take students to watch a volcano erupt, but I can have them watch a video in class. Students are going to use the technology alongside the practices. They're going to describe why they chose one piece of technology over another. They're going to use that technology to make their thinking visible, and it'll aid in their obtaining and communicating information. And I think for observers afterwards, why did you have students use that device or app or piece of technology? How would you have taught this lesson if the device app was not available? So that's really important. If the answer is, well, I would just run copies, then they're probably not, I should say, using technology in authentic ways. And then finally, how did technology influence the nature of collaboration between students? Again, the scientific process now, you have researchers collaborating across continents, across the oceans. And so we can use these tools in authentic ways to engage students in scientific collaboration. I think that this is also important. Learning is a process, not an event. So if learning is a process, it means teaching is also a process, not an event. And so all the indicators of good science teaching will not be visible during a single observation. Effectively evaluating good science teachers requires more than just one formal observation and a few short walkthroughs. I can't stress that enough. You're not going to see all of those things happen on one day in a 45-minute period. What you want is some preponderance of the evidence over the course of several evaluations or observations, and using a host of different artifacts, so we can see if good science teaching is happening in a specific classroom. The last thing I want to do before leaving y'all is remember that rubrics and observations for evaluating good science teaching should be used to help teachers improve. I know by law we have to give some sort of evaluative or there is an evaluative nature of those observations, but we also want to help teachers improve. I have some upcoming webinars as well. So the first topic next week is, what does the T in STEM really mean? On the 19th, there's no webinar because I will be traveling to NSTA and NCELA in Denver. If you're interested, please join me or email me. And if you want to meet and talk about stuff, I have several sessions at NSTA as well. On the 26th, I'm going to address how are we going to make sure they pass the end of the year test. And then on April 2nd, I'm going to answer the question that students use, when am I going to use this, in a little bit more in depth. If you're interested in other professional learning opportunities with ADI, please check out our programs and events and professional learning pages. And you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And if you have questions, you can email me at todd@argumentdriveninquiry.com, or find me on LinkedIn at Todd Hutner. That's also my Twitter and Threads address if you are interested. So thank you all very much for joining me this afternoon. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. And like I said, if you do have any questions, please do not hesitate to email me.